The first time I really noticed the man next door, I was sitting on my front steps trying not to cry over a broken coffee mug. It was the blue one, the hand-thrown ceramic piece I'd bought myself the morning I graduated nursing school. The one with the uneven rim and the small chip on the handle that I'd always meant to fix. I had carried it through 4 apartments, 2 cities, and 1 marriage. Then my husband Derek set a box of my things on the porch without asking, without warning, and the mug had slipped out and hit the concrete steps before I could catch it. I was 31 years old, sitting on the porch of a house that was no longer mine, holding 2 pieces of something I couldn't put back together. That was when I saw him. He was walking a large black dog along the far edge of the yard. A Belgian Malinois, I would later learn, named Scout. The man was tall, dark-haired, wearing a plain gray shirt and moving with the kind of quiet, deliberate calm that made him look like he had nowhere to be and wasn't sorry about it. He glanced over once. Not the kind of look that lingers or pries. Just an acknowledgement. Like he saw me and understood that I didn't need anything said. He walked on. I didn't think much about him that day. I had other things to think about. Derek and I had been married for 4 years. We met when I was 26 and he was 34, a corporate attorney with a corner office downtown Portland and a way of making everything feel intentional. The restaurant he chose, the wine he ordered, the exact moment he reached across the table and covered my hand with his. I had never been with someone who made decisions like they mattered. It felt like safety. It felt like being chosen. We married after 18 months. I moved into his house in the West Hills, a beautiful craftsman with original hardwood floors and a garden that I filled with herbs and lavender, and a climbing rose that took 3 years to finally reach the top of the trellis. The trouble started quietly, the way it always does. Derek wanted children. I wanted children. That part was never in question, but the months passed, then the seasons, then the years. We saw specialists. We tried things. I won't go into all of it because some grief is private, but I will say that each failed cycle took something out of me that I didn't know how to name. And Derek, to his credit, at first, was patient. Kind, even. Then something shifted. It was subtle enough that I almost missed it. A comment here, a silence there. The way he stopped asking how I was feeling after appointments. The way he started taking longer to come home from work. I told myself it was stress. I told myself marriage goes through seasons. I told myself a lot of things. Then one evening in March, I came home from a double shift at the hospital and found him sitting at the kitchen table with a folder in front of him. He had the expression he used in depositions, composed, distant, already decided. He said he had been thinking. He said he didn't want to waste more time. He said the word compatibility 3 times in under 2 minutes, which told me he had rehearsed this. He said that he needed a partner who could give him a family, and that after everything we tried, it was clear that wasn't going to be me. I sat down across from him and said nothing for a long time. Then I said, "You think this is my fault?" He didn't answer, which was its own answer. What happened next is the part I am still angry about. 4 years later, and I think I have earned the right to stay angry about it. Derek was an attorney. I was a nurse who worked 12-hour shifts and trusted her husband. He had drawn up a postnuptial agreement. I hadn't known such a thing existed, and he put it in front of me that same night while I was still in my scrubs, while I was still trying to process what he'd just said. It was dense with legal language I didn't understand. He told me it was standard. He told me it would make the process cleaner for both of us. He told me I should sign it that night while we were both calm. I signed it. I have thought about that moment more times than I can count. I have thought about how tired I was and how much I still loved him despite everything, and how the part of me that trusted him hadn't caught up yet to the part of me that should have been afraid. The agreement gave me 60 days to vacate the house and a settlement of $8,000. $8,000 for 4 years? For the climbing rose I'd planted and the garden I'd grown and the life I had built inside someone else's walls? My mother, when I finally told her, was very quiet on the phone. My mother has a particular silence she uses when she is furious and also frightened for you and doesn't want to say the wrong thing. That was the silence she used. Then she said carefully, "Sweetheart, did you have anyone look at that document before you signed it?" I had not. I found an apartment in a neighborhood called Selwood, on the southeast side of the river. It was a small upstairs unit in a converted Victorian, with tall windows and a radiator that clanked in the night, and a landlord who had left a small window box on the railing already planted with something I didn't recognize yet. My neighbor's name. I found out the next morning when he was leaving with Scout just as I was dragging a box up the front steps, was Callum. He introduced himself briefly. Firm handshake, direct eye contact, not unkind. He offered to carry the box upstairs without making it feel like a big thing. I said I was fine. He nodded like he believed me, which I appreciated, and went on his way. Over the next few weeks, I learned small things about him through ordinary proximity. He kept unusual hours, sometimes leaving very early, sometimes not until afternoon. He received packages occasionally that he signed for without expression. He was quiet in a way that felt active rather than absent, like someone who had learned to take up only the space he needed. The dog was impeccably trained. A woman from down the street once asked Callum what he did for work, the bright social way people ask in new neighborhoods, and he smiled politely and said he consulted for a few companies, which was technically an answer without being one. I was too consumed with my own life to pay much attention. I had taken on extra shifts at the hospital. I was trying to rebuild a budget that made sense on my salary alone. The $8,000 settlement sounded like something until you set it against first and last month's rent, moving costs, replacing the things I hadn't thought to take from the house, and the quiet mounting reality of starting over at 31. I was also, without admitting it to myself, still grieving. Not Derek, or not only Derek. I was grieving the version of the future I had believed in. The children I had wanted. The years I had spent trying. There is a particular exhaustion in hoping for something for a long time and then having to put it down, and I was carrying that exhaustion like a second body. My mother called every Sunday. She didn't push. She listened, and she reminded me that I was not the problem, which was something I needed to hear more often than I admitted. In April, my car broke down in a grocery store parking lot. I had just finished a night shift and I was still in my scrubs, and I had stopped to pick up a few things, and when I came out with my 2 bags, the car would not start. I sat there for a moment. I called roadside assistance and was told the wait would be 90 minutes. I put my head back against the headrest and closed my eyes. "Do you need help?" I opened my eyes. Callum was standing a few feet away with a reusable bag in one hand, car keys in the other. He must have been doing his own grocery shopping. "Roadside assistance is coming," I said. "That's fine," he said. "I can wait with you. You really don't have to." He set his groceries in his own car, which was parked 2 spots over, and came back and leaned against the passenger side of mine. Not pushy, just present. I told him I didn't want to be a burden. He said he didn't have anywhere to be. We waited in the parking lot for an hour and 20 minutes, and he told me, in the measured way he had of talking, that he had grown up in Spokane, that he had been in the Army for 8 years, that he had come to Portland for reasons he wasn't specific about and had found it quieter than expected, which he appreciated. I told him I was a nurse, that I had recently gone through a divorce, that I was still figuring things out. He didn't offer opinions about any of this. He just listened, which was, I realized, rarer than it should have been. When the tow truck came, he waited until I had arranged everything, then said he hoped the rest of my day was easier, and drove away. I thought about that afternoon more than once, the straightforwardness of it. Someone had seen that I needed something and had simply stayed. The weeks that followed were ordinary in most ways. I worked. I cooked simple things in my small kitchen. I called my mother. I ran along the river on my days off and watched the water move and tried to remember what I wanted from a life that was now entirely my own to shape. Callum and I crossed paths the way neighbors do, on the front steps, in the small parking area behind the building, occasionally in the narrow hallway by the mailboxes. He always had a few quiet words, nothing invasive. He brought me a plant once, a small rosemary in a terracotta pot, and said he'd gotten an extra at the farmer's market and thought I might have use for it, given the window box. I planted it the same afternoon. In May, I realized my period was late. I sat with that information for 3 days before I took a test, and another 2 days after I took the test, just sitting with the reality of it, trying to understand how I felt. Derek and I had been separated for 4 months, but we had still been living in the same house for the first 2 of those months, while I arranged everything, and there had been one night, I won't explain it, one last night that I hadn't thought would matter. It mattered. I called my OB on a Thursday. I scheduled blood work. I sat in the waiting room of the clinic in my regular clothes, not my scrubs, which made everything feel stranger. And I answered questions and had blood drawn and scheduled an ultrasound. I had not told anyone. Not my mother. Not the single friend in the city I had confided in about the divorce. I was still deciding what to think before I figured out what to say. The ultrasound was on a Tuesday. The technician was professional and kind, and she moved the wand slowly and then paused and then said in a measured voice, "I want you to take a breath." I looked at the screen. She pointed out 2 separate shapes, 2 separate heartbeats. I stared at the screen for a long time. Twins. I called my mother from the parking lot. I sat in my car and I told her everything. Derek, the agreement, the one night, the test, the ultrasound. And she was quiet for the entire thing, her particular listening silence, and when I finished she said, "You have never needed the right container to bloom. You've always been the plant." I didn't fully understand what she meant that day. I would later. I thought for a long time about whether to tell Derek. He had been the one to end things. He had been the one to say I couldn't give him a family. Part of me felt a cold, clarifying satisfaction at the thought of what I now knew. And part of me was simply frightened of what he would say, of what he might do, of whether his being an attorney would once again mean he had more tools in this situation than I did. I told my mother I was afraid. She told me to find a good attorney before I made any decisions. She said it the way she says things that are not suggestions. I found an attorney named Patricia, a family law specialist who had an office in a converted bungalow on Belmont and who had, I would come to understand, an extraordinary instinct for when someone has signed something under duress. She reviewed the post-nuptial agreement. She was very quiet for a moment after she finished reading it, and then she looked at me over her glasses and said, "This was drawn up by a skilled attorney who understood exactly what he was doing, but that doesn't mean it's untouchable." She asked me to tell her about the night I signed it, the timeline, my condition, what Derek had said. I told her everything. She made careful notes. She told me she would look at what we had to work with. I left her office feeling something I hadn't felt in months, which was that I was not alone in this. I told Callum about the pregnancy on a Sunday evening, which surprised me because I hadn't planned to. We had both been on the porch at the same time, the way we sometimes were in the evenings, and he had asked, in his direct way, whether I was all right, because I'd seemed quieter than usual the last few weeks. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "I'm pregnant. Twins. My ex-husband is the father, and we're divorced, and I haven't told him yet, and my attorney thinks I may have signed away rights that I shouldn't have signed away." Callum was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need? Not what happened, or are you sure, or what are you going to do? Just what do you need?" I didn't have a good answer. I said I thought I mostly just needed things to not get worse. He nodded. He said he had some experience with complicated legal situations, from his time in service and after, and that if I ever wanted a second perspective on anything, he was happy to listen. No pressure. Just an offer. I thanked him and didn't think much more about it. I should tell you what I found out about Callum, and when I found it out, because the order matters. I found out in pieces, the way you find out true things about a person, not from what they tell you directly, but from the edges of things. A phone call I half overheard through the open window in which he spoke with an authority that didn't match the quiet man who carried my groceries. A visit one afternoon from 2 men in good suits who shook his hand with deference and left within 30 minutes. A name that appeared in an article I came across by accident while looking for something else entirely. A profile of a private security and investigations firm based in Portland, one of 3 in the country that consulted for federal agencies in complex financial fraud cases. The founder's name in the article was Callum Reese. I stared at that article for a long time. The next evening, I knocked on his door. He opened it with Scout beside him and an expression that was entirely neutral, as if he had no idea what I was about to say, which I am now fairly certain was not true. I said, "You're not just a consultant for a few companies." He considered this for a moment. He said, "No." I asked him why he hadn't said anything. He said he didn't lead with it because it tended to change how people treated him, and he'd found it was better to let people form their own impressions first. He said it without apology, but also without arrogance. I asked him if he knew anything about my husband. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your ex-husband's firm has been the subject of a preliminary inquiry for some time. I can't tell you everything, but I can tell you that some of the financial structures he uses in client agreements, including certain personal agreements, are currently of interest to people I work with." I stood in his doorway and looked at him. I said, "Were you investigating him when we met?" He said, "I was in this neighborhood for reasons adjacent to that work. Meeting you was not part of any plan." I went back to my apartment and sat with that for a very long time. The thing was, and I had to be honest with myself about this, I had already trusted him before I knew any of it. The parking lot afternoon. The rosemary plant. The way he had simply stayed when I needed someone to stay. None of that had been performed. None of it had been designed to win me over. It had just been a person behaving decently, over and over, without needing credit for it. I thought about what my mother had said when I told her about him, that he sounded like someone who showed up in his actions rather than his words, and that those were the people worth knowing. I went back to his door the next evening and said I wasn't angry. I said I needed time to think. He said he understood and that there was no pressure at all. My attorney, Patricia, when I told her about Callum's work, was briefly silent and then said in a very measured tone that this was interesting. She was already building a case around the postnuptial agreement based on coercion and the specific circumstances of the signing. She had found 2 precedents in Oregon case law that she thought were relevant. She said, carefully, that if there were parallel inquiries happening into Derek's professional conduct, that might become relevant context. I did not ask for details. I trusted her. In July, Derek found out I was pregnant. I don't know how he found out before I told him. I have my suspicions. I told him through my attorney formally, which was the correct thing to do, and the response came back through his attorney, and it was, even by the standards of everything that had already happened, breathtaking. His position was that the post-nuptial agreement governed the dissolution of any jointly acquired assets or responsibilities arising from the marriage. His position was that he had declared the marriage incompatible and that this situation was, legally, my concern. Patricia read his response and was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at me and said, "He's afraid." I asked how she could tell. She said, "Because he's moving fast and loud. Confident people in strong positions don't do that." We filed our response 3 weeks later. We challenged the postnuptial agreement on grounds of duress, inadequate legal representation, and the specific timing and circumstances of signing. We documented the 4 years of fertility treatment, the costs borne jointly, the career accommodations I had made. We submitted a detailed accounting of what I had contributed to a life that I had been handed $8,000 to vacate. Derek's attorney called twice in the same week. Patricia told me to let her handle it. Then something happened that I had not anticipated. In late August, a story appeared in the Portland Business Journal. It was brief and factual and carefully worded, the way those stories are when they know more than they're saying. It described a preliminary investigation into certain financial practices at Derek's firm, specifically the use of restrictive personal agreements drafted by firm attorneys for private clients, and questions about whether those agreements had been represented accurately to the parties who signed them. Derek was not named directly, his firm was. My phone rang that afternoon. It was a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a woman's voice said she was a journalist with the Journal and that she understood I might have personal experience with the type of agreement currently under review. She had been told I might be willing to speak. I asked her who had told her that. She said she wasn't at liberty to say. I thought about Callum. I thought about what he had said, that my situation was adjacent to something he'd been working on. I thought about the word adjacent and what it might mean when used by a man who chose his words the way he chose everything else, carefully and only when necessary. I didn't talk to the journalist. Patricia advised against it while proceedings were active, but I thought, for the first time in months, that the floor under the situation might hold me after all. Derek and I reached a settlement in September. I will not tell you the exact number because some things are still private, but I will tell you that it was not $8,000. It was not close to $8,000. It addressed the 4 years fairly. It addressed the fertility treatment costs. It addressed what Patricia called the structural inequity of the original agreement. Derek signed without going to court. The twins were born on a Thursday in late October, a boy and a girl. I named the boy James after my grandfather, and the girl Nora, which was a name I had loved since I read it somewhere years ago and kept in the back of my mind like something I was saving. My mother flew in from Tucson and stayed for 3 weeks. She held Nora for 2 hours the first afternoon and was perfectly content and didn't say anything for most of it. At one point she said, "You grew this. You did all of this." She wasn't talking about just the babies. Callum had sent flowers to the hospital, white ranunculus in a simple vase. No dramatic gesture, just a note that said, "Congratulations. You were never the problem." I read that line 4 times. I had been turning something over in my mind for months, the question of what Callum was to me and what I was to him, and whether any of this was something or whether it was just proximity and shared difficulty. The way people can mean a great deal to each other within a specific season and then move naturally in different directions. I was not ready to be in anything. I knew that. I was 32 years old with a newborn boy and a newborn girl, and a settlement I was still processing and a version of myself I was still learning. But I knew something about the difference between someone who performs reliability and someone who simply is reliable, and I knew on which side of that line Callum lived. In December, when the babies were 6 weeks old and my mother had returned to Tucson and I was back in my apartment with James in the bassinet and Nora asleep on my chest, exhausted in the way that has its own particular sweetness, I sent Callum a text that said, "I think I'm ready to have dinner." Not immediately, but soon. "If that's still something you'd want," he replied within 2 minutes. It said, "It is. Whenever you're ready, I'll be here." I put my phone down and looked at Nora's sleeping face and thought about the morning the coffee mug broke. I thought about sitting on those steps and feeling like I was holding the 2 halves of something I couldn't repair. I had thought then that what I was losing was the life I built. What I hadn't understood yet was that I had built it inside the wrong structure and that structures can be left. The things that matter most, the work you do with your hands, the love you keep showing up for, the way you hold your ground even when no one is watching, those travel with you. You are not what breaks, you are what remains.